Thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's session. So we have two interesting videos lined up for today, one on GVC indicators and the other on network analysis. So we'll first be playing the session on GVC indicators.
Following the three GBC indicators that we will cover in this session. Recall that GBCs involve fragmentation of production processes across borders. This means that traditional trade statistics may now be less accurate in capturing the dynamics of modern production arrangements. In particular, GBCs pose a unique analytical challenge since conventional trade statistics implicitly bundle together value added of different origins. To illustrate, exports of A to B may contain contributions from C and D, which would generally be hidden in traditional trade statistics or gross exports. We've learned in the previous session that one solution to address this is to decompose exports into value-added components using the multi-regional input-output tables such as the ADB MRIOT database. There are four ways for a firm to participate in GVCs. Knowing these concepts will help us in operationalizing GVC participation using actual data. First, a firm can participate in GVCs by exporting its domestic value added in intermediate exports used by a direct importing economy to produce for domestic consumption. Secondly, a firm can participate in GVCs by exporting its domestic value added in intermediate exports used by a direct importing economy to produce products for a third country. These two are from the perspective of the producers, and these constitute the forward participation in global value chains. Another way for a firm to participate in GVCs is by using foreign value added to produce its gross exports. Finally, a firm can also participate in GVCs by using foreign value added to produce for domestic use. Now, these last two are from the perspective of the users, and these constitute the backward participation in GVCs. Let's have an example. Suppose India exports semiconductors to USA, and then USA uses these semiconductors to produce computer parts, and then USA exports these computer parts to the rest of the world, and then the rest of the world process them to produce computers for the consumption of residents of the rest of the world. Is this part of GVC activities? The answer is yes. So in this case, India exports its domestic value added embedded in semiconductors to USA. And then USA uses India's value added in producing computer parts, which the USA exports to the rest of the world, where it is processed into a computer to be eventually absorbed domestically. Here, India is participating in GVCs as a producer of value added, and hence, this will form part of India's forward GVC participation. The USA has both forward and backward GVC participation in this case, while the rest of the world is participating in GVCs from a backward perspective. GVC participation measures the importance of GVCs to an economy or an economy sector. In this session, I'll discuss two approaches in measuring GVC participation. The first one is the production-based approach following Wang Wei Yusu in 2017. And then the second one is that of the trade-based approach following Boring and Mancini 2019. First, let's discuss production-based approach. Let's consider this example. In 2020, India's value added totaled 2,537 billion US dollars. Now, this reflects value added generated by India's industries. We can then decompose or slice up this figure. Of India's total value added, 2,140 billion US dollars is absorbed within its domestic territory. 166 billion US dollars is exported as final products. And lastly, the remaining 231 billion US dollars is exported as intermediates. The portion of value added that is exported as final products correspond to what is known as traditional trade, while the portion of value added that is exported as intermediates correspond to GBCs or GBC trade. Now, dividing 231 billion US dollars by the total value added, as in this equation, we get 9.1%. This will later on be understood as the forward Gbc participation. Now, we can also calculate Gbc participation from another perspective. Again, in 2020, India's final consumption totaled 2,648 billion US dollars. Now, this amount reflects the value that is consumed by residents of India or in India in general. Like before, we can also slice up this figure. Of India's total final consumption, 2,140 billion US dollars is sourced within its domestic territory. 166 billion US dollars is considered sourced from the traditional trade, while the remaining 342 billions of US dollars is what is understood to be part of the GBC activities. Now, dividing 342 billion US dollars by the total amount of final consumption, we get 12.9%. Now, this corresponds to India's backward GBC participation. To summarize, we've calculated forward GBC participation as the share of value produced that is absorbed into GBCs. In contrast, we've also calculated backward GBC participation as the share of value consumed that is sourced from GBCs. Now, GBC participation can either be considered as simple or complex. In the first example, India exports intermediates to a foreign economy. There is only one border crossing in this case, which makes it a simple GBC arrangement. In the second example, India exports intermediates to a foreign economy, say the United States of America, and then the USA re-exports it to a third economy, say the People's Republic of China, which is also the market of final absorption. Now, this second example involves more than one border crossing and is therefore considered as complex GBCs. Now let's move on to other approaches the other approach in calculating for GBC participation rate. This time we consider the trade-based approach. Also in 2020, India's gross exports totaled 478 billion US dollars. Now this reflects the value of goods and services exported by India. We can also slice up this figure like before. Of India's total gross exports, 308 billion US dollars is India's domestic value added that is directly absorbed by an importing economy. Now, this is equivalent to the box in Borin and Mancini exports decomposition. Again, this is equivalent to the box in Borin and Mancini exports decomposition. Meanwhile, 88 billions of US dollars is the domestic value added re-exported abroad, or the domestic value added that is absorbed back to India. This is equivalent to the sum of Rex and Ref under the Borin and Mancini exports decomposition. Lastly, 82 billion US dollars is the foreign value added content plus the pure double count in India's exports. Now, this will be equivalent to the foreign value added, or FVA, plus PDC, or pure double count, under Borin and Mancini exports decomposition. The VAX, or the domestic value added that is directly absorbed by importing economy, corresponds to the traditional trade. The domestic value added re-exported abroad, or the domestic value added exports that is absorbed back to India, corresponds to the forward GBC participation. And here it is calculated as 18.4%. Again, this is the sum of REX and REF divided by the total gross exports. The foreign value added content plus pure double count in India's exports corresponds to the backward GBC participation, which is calculated here as 17.2% of the total gross exports of India. Now recall these exports decomposition framework under Borin and Mancini. Trade-based GBC participation rate comes from the value-added trade accounting framework introduced by Borin and Mancini in 2019. DAVAX identifies the traditional type of trade. GBC-related trade includes all the traded items that cross at least two international borders before being absorbed in the final demand. Note that GBC-related activities correspond to the highlighted terms in this framework or in this schematic diagram. The terms enclosed in the blue box are the ones that correspond to the forward GBC participation, while the terms enclosed in green box correspond to the backward GBC participation. Now, GBC participation rate can be expressed as the share of the terms corresponding to GBC trade to the total gross exports of an economy, as shown in this equation. So GBC trade or GBC participation based on trade approach is equal to REX plus REF plus FBA plus PDC divided by the gross exports. Take note that these are the terms that correspond to GBC activities. Consistent with the figure shown in the previous slide, GBC participation can further be divided into forward component and backward component, as shown in this equation. So GBC participation based on trade approach can be decomposed into forward GBCs and backward GBCs. So forward GBC participation is equal to REX plus REF divided by gross exports, while backward GBC participation under the trade approach is calculated as the sum of FBA, or foreign value added, and pure double count divided by the gross exports. Now, while both approaches present a measure of GBC participation, they can give very different values for the same economy or the same sector. Now, trade-based rate can be thought of as the intensive rate of participation. That is, an increase in the trade-based rate implies greater GBC participation for the same level of exports. Meanwhile, production-based approach or production-based rate can be thought of as the extensive rate of participation. An increase in the production-based rate implies a greater role for GBCs in the overall production. Another important comparison between the two is their definition of traditional trade. Now, in the production-based approach, GBC is captured by the exports of intermediates, while in the trade-based approach, under Borin and Mancini framework, DAVAX 2 is still considered as traditional trade. Remember that DAVAX 2 refers to the exports of intermediates that is directly absorbed by an importing economy. Wang Wei Yushu distinguishes between simple and complex GBCs, but under the Borin and Mancini framework, simple GBCs is part of the traditional trade. Now, it is also important to emphasize the forward and the backward GBC participation following trade-based approach, the difference between the two, between forward and backward GBC participation rate following the trade-based approach. Now, under the trade-based approach, forward GBC participation and the backward GBC participation are additive, but under the production-based approach following Wang Wei Yushu in 2017, forward GBC participation and backward GBC participation are not additive. The reason for this is that the denominator in this formula are not the same, unlike the denominator under the trade-based approach following Borin and Mancini framework in 2019. In recent publications, the Asian Development Bank has also adopted Borin and Mancini exports decomposition to calculate GBC participation using production-based approach. And this would be conceptually similar to the Wang Wei Yushu forward GBC participation rate as shown in this equation. So under the Wang Wei Yushu forward GBC participation, this is the equivalent calculation following the Borin and Mancini express decomposition terms. So GBC participation under production approach is equal to DAVAX 2 plus re-exports plus reflection divided by the total gross domestic product. To summarize, this is how we calculate for GBC participation using trade-based and production-based approaches. As mentioned, these are the ones that we are using in recent publications in ADB. So again, under trade-based approach, the forward GBC participation is calculated as REX plus RE divided by exports, while the backward GBC participation is calculated as FBA plus PDC divided by gross exports. And under the production-based approach, GBC participation rate under production-based approach is equal to DAVAX 2 plus REX plus REF divided by gross domestic product. All right. Now this chart here appears as figure 1.2 in the GBC development report released in 2021. Now this figure shows the trade-based approach GBC participation rates for each of the economy in ADB MRIOT in 2000, 2010, and 2019. Immediately noticeable in this figure is that almost all economies saw participation expand from 2000 to 2019. So the year 2000 here is denoted by the dark blue dots, while the year 2019 here is denoted by the red dots. Looking at India, we see that its GBC participation is below the world average, and it closely ranks with other large economies such as the United States of America, Japan, Indonesia, and Brazil. It can also be noticed here that the economies in South Asia have the least GBC participation, including Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. The next chart shows the production-based forward GBC participation rates for the same set of economies and the same period. India's GBC participation still falls below the world average using the production-based approach. Nonetheless, India is ahead of some of its regional peers in South Asia in terms of GBC participation rate using production-based approach. So it is ahead of Sri Lanka, Nepal, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Now, before we proceed to the next GBC indicator, I also would like to point out that our team in ADB has also produced GBC participation rates for all 62 economies in the ADB MRIOT from the year 2000, 2007 up to 2020. Now, this data set is available in this website, https://mrio.adbx.online. And you may send your request to our colleague, Ms. Irene Talam, and her email address is provided here, italam1.consultant@adb.org. Now we move on to calculating revealed comparative advantage, or RCA. Revealed comparative advantage, or RCA, is based on the Ricardian theory, which posits that patterns of trade among countries are governed by the relative differences in productivity. That's according to UNCTAD. Using exports data, we can therefore determine whether an economy has a comparative advantage for certain sectors. Here, we show the formula in calculating for TRCA, and TRCA is simply calculated as the ratio between the two shares, this share and this share. The first share is the share of an economy sector's gross exports in the economy's total gross exports, while the second share is the sector's gross exports from all economies as a share of the world's total gross exports. So we just get the ratio of the two shares and we will get the traditional RCA index. Now, an economy is said to be competitive exporter in sector I if TRCA for sector I is greater than 1. So these are the shares that you need to calculate in order for you to compute for the TRCA index. Now, what's the problem with traditional RCA? Again, it makes use of gross exports. And gross exports ignore the fact that a country sector's value added may be exported indirectly via the country's exports in other sectors. A conceptually correct measure for this should include indirect value-added exports. Gross exports ignore the fact also that a country sector's gross exports partly reflect foreign value-added content. A conceptually correct measure for this should include or should exclude foreign value-added content. Now, given the caveats earlier mentioned in using gross exports in a highly GVC-oriented world, a new measure of competitiveness in productivity and exports can be measured using the domestic value added through the forward linkage, which is denoted by DVA_F. Now, DVA_F can be calculated following Wang Wei Yushu in 2018, but we skip the details in this session. The point here is that DVA_F now represents the domestic value added content in an economy sector's gross exports. So instead of using gross exports, we now use DVAF in calculating for the new revealed comparative advantage index. Same as before, if the NRCA is greater than 1, we say that an economy is a competitive exporter of a particular sector. Now let's have a numerical example. This is a numerical example in calculating TRCA and NRCA. Suppose we need to compute for the traditional and the new revealed comparative advantage index of each sector, of sector 3 for economy A. So let's focus on sector 3. Now, so that it's easier for us to track the calculation, let's compute the numerator and the denominator separately. Let's first calculate for the numerator in step 1. Let's focus on economy A. Here, we get the share of sector 3 gross exports to the total gross exports based on, again, here we get the share of sector 3 gross exports to the total gross exports in economy A. Now we do the same process for value added exports based on forward linkage or DVAF. So for example here, under TRCA numerator, this is 150 divided by 500, and then under NRCA numerator, this is 70 divided by 320. Next, we get the sum of sector 3's gross exports for all of the economies and divide it by the world's gross exports, as shown here. So the TRCA denominator should be 150 plus 180 plus 100 divided by 2,910, while for NRCA, it should be 70 plus 200 plus 300 divided by 2,540. We now have the two shares. So again, the numerator tells us the share of an economy sector's gross exports in the economy's total gross exports, while the denominator would tell us the share of sector's gross exports from all economies in the world's total gross exports. Finally, in step 3, we simply get the ratios of the two shares. Here, TRCA is equal to 0.30 divided by 0.15 or 2.03, while NRCA is equal to 0.22 divided by 0.22, which is roughly equivalent to 0.97. So here, TRCA is 2.03, which is greater than 1. And this means that the exports of sector 3 of economy A is competitive using the gross exports approach, following the traditional RCA. However, if we use NRCA, the NRCA is computed to be less than 1, which means that it does not have the comparative advantage for sector 3. So in other words, there is a different story when we make use of the value added approach in calculating for the RCA as compared to the gross exports approach when calculating for the traditional RCA. Now this figure shows the traditional RCA and NRCA for India for year 2020. This dashed line over here would be the threshold. So above this threshold, we say that the sector is competitive, while below the threshold, the sectors are said to be not competitive. NRCA are measured in green bars, while TRCA is denoted by the orange triangles. Now, as expected, business activities not elsewhere classified yields the highest RCA using either of the two approaches. using gross exports or value added in calculating for the revealed comparative advantage index. Now, this reflects the fact that India is known for its huge business process outsourcing industry. Now, it's also apparent that TRCA overstates India's competitiveness. A conceptually more precise measure is RCA based on value added, as shown by the green bars. Using the new revealed comparative advantage index, India's exports is also competitive for the following sectors: retail trade, textiles, agriculture, leather, and chemicals, among others. Now let's move on to exports diversification. Exports diversification is broadly defined as the breadth of the composition of the export basket of an economy. This measure has been relevant since export diversification has been increasingly seen as means to accelerate economic growth, to mitigate instability due to price, demand, and exchange rate fluctuations, as well as to stabilize export earnings in the long run. In contrast, export concentration finds its basis from David Ricardo's comparative advantage and factor endowment following Heckscher-Ohlin model. To this end, policymakers need to do some balancing act to support its economic development agenda or objective. Exports diversification is traditionally measured using gross exports. However, using gross exports may hide some important features of international production sharing arrangements. First, it may lead to double counting since gross exports still contain foreign value added. And secondly, the use of gross exports does not capture indirect value added by the supporting sectors. Hence, a new measure of exports diversification is proposed by Bajaj et al. In 2022, which includes my colleagues Janine Lezatin and Christian Habagat. They recommend to use the value-added approach based on forward linkage or VAX-F. In the Borin and Mancini exports decomposition framework, VAX-F is conceptually the same as the sum of DAVAX and REF. Again, DAVAX is the domestic value added that is directly absorbed abroad, while REF is the reflection. Okay, this should be DAVAX plus REX instead of reflection. Again, this should be corrected. VAX-F is equal to DAVAX plus REX, not REF. Okay? Okay. There are several ways to measure exports concentration of an economy. Now, these measures include the Thiel index, the Gini index, and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, or simply known as HHI. Of the three, HHI is most preferred by some researchers because of its computational simplicity. Now, HHI is derived as the weighted sum of the squares of the share of each sector or product group in the total exports of an economy. HHI ranges from 0 to 1. A lower HHI means high exports diversification, while an HHI that is close to 1 means a high exports concentration. Mathematically, Herfindahl-Hirschman index, or HHI, is given by this equation, where SIC is the share of sector I in the exports of country C, while NCT is the number of active sectors in country C at period T. So basically, you will just need to get first the share of sector I in the exports of country C and take the square of that and take the sum for all of the active sectors in country C at period T. Now, the base form can be normalized to correct for HHI's sensitivity to the number of active sectors. Now, these terms are then added in the equation. So previously, we only have this term included in the calculation for HHI. We normalize HHI by including these terms. So minus 1 over the number of active sectors all over 1 minus the number of active 1 divided by the number of active sectors. All right. Okay, let's have this numerical example. Suppose we have an economy with 5 sectors: primary sector, low technology manufacturing, medium to high technology manufacturing sector, business services, and personal and public services. Now, exports here are expressed in 2 columns. One is in gross terms, while the other one is in value-added terms based on forward linkage. Right? So value-added exports here is equivalent to the sum of DAVAX, or the domestic value added absorbed directly abroad, and then REX, or re-exports. Okay? The first step here is to calculate the shares of each sector with respect to the totals. All right? So what we do here is to get the share of, say, primary sector to the total gross exports, and here the share of primary sector's VA to the total value-added exports. So we will get these figures. So 29 divided by the sum of these, 7 divided by the sum of these should give you these numbers, right? Now, the second step is to simply get the squares of each of these shares. So you'll have 6% times 6%, 9% times 9%, 18% times 18%, 13% times 13%, and so on. So you will have these vectors over here. And third, we need to get the column sum of the figures in step 2. So you just take the column sum of these, that will yield 31%. You just take the column sum of these, that will yield 32%. And finally, we need to substitute the values following this equation, the normalized version of calculating for the HHI. Here, the number of active sectors is equal to 5. Therefore, we have this calculation for HHI based on gross exports. You have 0.31 minus 1 over 5 divided by 1 minus 1 over 5. That should give you 14%. While here you have 0.32 minus 1 over the number of active sectors divided by 1 minus 1 over the number of active sectors. That should give you about 16%. So again, the normalized HHI are now as follows: 14% using gross exports, or 16% using value-added exports. Note that in some studies, figures are not expressed in terms of percentage. Now, this figure shows the average HHI of selected economies in the Asia and the Pacific region from the year 2007 up to 2018. So a comparison or the average between for the HHI for the years 2007 up to 2018. Again, take note that HHI close to 1 means high exports concentration, while HHI that is close to 0 means high exports diversification. Now, India is one of the most diversified economies in Asia and the Pacific region. It ranks closely with the Republic of Korea, Malaysia, Fiji, Vietnam, and Japan. The least diversified economies would include Brunei Darussalam, Mongolia, and Maldives. The next figure here shows the HHI for some economies in the Asia and the Pacific region. Uh, Now, it shows here that there is a decline in HHI between the year 2007 and 2018. This means that these economies become more diversified between the two periods. Now, this is true in the case of India, Bhutan, Brunei, Cambodia, Fiji, and some other economies, including Thailand, Vietnam, Lao People's Democratic Republic, and Maldives. Okay. Now, this figure over here compares the HHI for India using gross exports and value-added exports. So, HHI using gross exports is denoted by the blue line, while HHI following the value-added approach is denoted by the red line. It is apparent in this chart that there is a convergence in the exports diversification measure in the more recent periods. The chart also suggests that the use of gross exports underestimates India's exports diversification between the years 2007 up to 2018. It is also observed that HHI for both measures had significant increase from the year 2017 onwards, which means that India has become less diversified in the past few years. Okay, take note that in this calculation, under the Borin and Mancini express decomposition, the VAX plus REX is conceptually similar to VAX-F, and that's what we use in calculating exports diversification. Now, to conclude this session, we've seen that GBC participation is a measure that allows us to assess the economy's involvement in cross-border production sharing arrangements. Now, this can be calculated using two approaches, using the production-based approach or the trade-based approach. Both can be seen from a forward and a backward perspective. Its calculation is reliant on the decomposition of gross exports into value-added components following the Borin and Mancini exports decomposition, which we use in the more recent publications of ADB. Indicators that are traditionally measured in gross terms can be recalculated using the value-added terms. Now, these indicators would include the calculation for the revealed comparative advantage and exports diversification. Using the value-added exports instead of gross exports accounts for the complexities of fragmented production as economies integrate into the global economy and into value chains. Now, these are the references which I used for these presentations. This ends my discussion, and thank you very much for listening. Let us know if you have any question or clarification. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Julian.
That was the first presentation on global value chains. I personally found it extremely interesting and I have a few questions. But before that, let us just check the chats for any questions that have come up, and anybody can also ask questions as it goes. I think some of them have already been answered. Anybody have any questions? Because I think some have already been answered here as I'm looking at the chat. Thank you, Julian, for answering them. So in case nobody has any questions, I have a few questions. I think Julian and the ADB team, if you can help me with that. First, now the value-added trade data
Mhm.
that's available in the ADB MRI OT database, or is it a separate database?
Correct. It's also available in the ADBX, the website that we've sent yesterday. So you could just request from Irene Talam, and then you could explore the website and then download the video, the data set for free.
Okay, all right. Now this data that you have, is it on HS code basis or you have some other categorization?
I'm sorry, what's the question again?
The value added trade data, is
Mhm.
it disaggregated at HS code basis or is it some other categorization?
All right. So remember that the calculations for these indicators depend on the level of disaggregation that we have in the ADB MRIO table. So basically, the most disaggregated data that we have is only up until 35 sectors following ISIC Rev 3. So we do not have the HSO2 because that means that we would require a much larger table, which is not existent for now.
Okay. Another question. Have you done any correlation between the 35 sectors and HS codes?
35 sectors, correlation between 35 sectors and HS codes.
Like there are 90, there are what 98 chapters at the two digit, and I think 6,000 or 7,000 at the six digit. So have there been is there any correlations as to which how many HS fit under which sector?
Right. So internally, in the compilation process of the ADB MRIO tables, so the team has the equivalence for which HSO2 categories would fall under certain sectors in the ADB MRIOT. So definitely we have such kind of mapping.
Is it publicly available?
I need to ask from the compilers of ADB MRIOT if it can be shared publicly. I will confirm this.
Okay, sure. A few more things. Now, the definitions of the different indicators, I know they are there in the presentations, but are they also including DVAX and REF and all of that? Is it also there in the MRIOT database? Like in the web page, do you have a tab where you list out the definitions?
Yes. So basically, the tables that can be downloaded in the ADBX are very much user friendly. So we made it a point that when the users download these tables, they should be able to identify what each of the terms mean. So they have the labels also attached to it.
Okay, now you have calculated the NCRA, which I think it's quite revealing actually. I mean, so basically you can do an RCA and then you can do an NRCA, and then you can see side by side how much the difference is. And I think particularly in trade policy, that would be like even leaving aside GVC analysis, just doing this
Mhm, mhm.
and doing it yearly on a yearly basis would give some interesting insights on the top exports of a country and how much of its top exports is domestically produced. So that is quite interesting. Now, I just want to build on that. You also have TCI and you also have IIT, intra-industry trade. So using the same format as you have used for NRCA, can we then calculate a TCI and IIT? along those lines. Trade
TCI.
complementarity index, IIT's intra-industry index.
Definitely yes. The only caveat here is that we're working on 35 sector basis when we make use of the data set that we have in ADB MRIOT. But yes, that can be done because, as you know, the trade complementarity index only makes use of the gross exports data. But then the point here is that you could transform these gross exports data, which hide a lot of stories in it, so that you could better capture what's really happening in terms of the trade in value added across different countries. So that can be done, but I don't think of any existing research within our team that has already done the same.
An interesting area for future research then.
Correct, correct. Yes.
Now another question. Forgive me if I'm getting ahead of myself. So you have value-added data, and then you can use this value-added data to find out how much of exports is domestically produced, how much of it is foreign imports.
Mhm.
Can if you just building on this, looking at intra-industry, looking at intra-regional trade or country-to-country trade, focusing only on how much of a domestic production is exported, focusing only on that. So how much of Indian domestically produced is exported to say Japan, and how much of domestically produced Japan is exported to India. Using this rationale, then do you think this would be a useful way of examining the possible impact of trade agreements? As in, have trade agreements led to an increase in the domestic value added in total exports?
Mhm. Definitely, definitely. The idea here is that we try to convert the gross exports into and decompose them into value-added terms because it might have this different story to tell when you look at the value-added terms instead of just the gross exports. So, for example, one economy might be exporting a lot, say a billion US dollars to say country B. However, its domestic value-added content of its exports only small, say about 20%, because the remaining, say, 75%, 80% would be attributed to the value added that's created by a foreign economy going into, say, your economy, which processes the goods for exports to another economy. So basically, it tells a very different story when you look at the gross exports. So, in cases wherein you want to see whether a specific trade policy would have an impact to the domestic economy instead of impacting other economies, then definitely decomposing the gross exports into value-added components would give you a better story on how it will affect GDP, for example.
Great, great. This is all very interesting. Thank you. Before we move on to the next session, may I just request all the participants to kindly switch on their video for just a second so that we can take a photo of the session. So I just request if you can switch it on for just a second, please. Okay, if you can please take a screenshot. Huh? Good. Thank you very much. You can go back to turning off your video now. So that was a very interesting session. Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to the next one on network analysis. May I kindly request the video be played? You hear the video? Just 1 minute, we're sharing the screen. Yeah, we're playing the video now.
I am a consultant at ADB. I work under the Statistics Data and Innovation Unit, and we do work mostly on big data to see if it can be used as an alternative source for economic statistics. What I'm going to show you now is an introduction to network analysis. So we're going to see some examples of network analysis. We're going to see what it means to do network analysis, and then we're going to try to do our own analysis on a sample data, specifically the trade network data. So before we tackle network analysis, let's first discuss what network science is. Network science is this broad field of research that studies systems or data using relational lens. And when we say relational lens, it's really just a way of looking into your data in terms of objects of interest and the relationship between them. So an example of data or system is social networks, biological networks, and computer networks. So looking at these three using a network point of view provides a common language to describe all of them. And a way to study networks is by using network analysis. So network analysis is simply just a set of methods. And this set of methods consists of being able to visualize your network, describing your network structure, and then measuring your network structures and dynamics using mathematical and statistical models. So an example of a network that we're going to show you now is a language network. What you see now is the global language network represented by their book translations. And this beautiful network is created by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So each circle here represents a language, and the way that they are positioned, those that are in the centers are mostly the ones that are connected into another language. So a connection here represents a translation from one language into the other. And it gives us an idea of the global popularity of the languages or their global influence. Those that are in the center seem to influence translations for all the other languages, and we call them global hubs. We have here English, French, Spanish, Dutch, Russian, and it's also interesting to see that there are specific families of languages. So one family is represented by one color. These families of languages all came from the Russian language. So these were all translated from the Russian language, so that if you remove the Russian language, you lose one set of language translations already. So that's how they identified the importance of these central hubs. Another example of network application is on social media. For the first one, what they did here was to apply text mining in order to arrive at network data and then look for communities within their network and identify the influencers. So it's similar to the language network where they tried to find the center of the network and they tried to see if those sub-networks are spreading disinformation. So it's really an interesting way of looking at how this information is spread by looking at the concentration of the network where uh, this uh, this information is most apparent. And we see also the agents of spread by looking at the influencers of your network. Another example is on port connectivity networks, and what they try to do here is to look for the optimal route for shipping lines by looking at the shortest possible way to go from one port into the other. And then lastly, and I think this one we're most familiar with, they looked at trade networks and analyzed it, computed measures of the network structures and dynamics, and they tried to see if those measures relate to economic fluctuations, specifically GDP. Now this publication is available at the ADP website. Alright, so now we're gonna try to create our own network, and we're gonna do it using data from input-output tables, or data derived from input-output tables. We will be studying 2 case studies for this presentation, and then the first one we're gonna just look on something basic. The second one we're gonna look at something more complex. So for the first one, I chose telecommunication sector because this telecommunication sector I find to be one of the India's top exports for 2020. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply the methods of network analysis that we have described earlier. Specifically, we're going to try to visualize the network. We're going to try to come up with measures to describe the network, and also its structure and dynamics. The data we're going to use is the 2020 exports decomposition by origin sector using the Borin and Mancini framework. We're using these data sets because we are interested on trade exports. So you'll see later why this data set is a perfect data set for producing network charts. So on the data set, you're only going to select the sector, which is telecommunications, and only the fields home economy, foreign economy, and exports. And since we're interested for India's trade network, we're only selecting economies that are directly trading to India. So that is home economy is India, or foreign economy is India. So when you do that, you're gonna arrive at this data set. So the first one at the right side. So this data set should have a home economy, foreign economy, and then the exports value. Now all of the economy should be trading with India. So India, United Kingdom, India, and so on. But other than this information, we also need another information, specifically on the economies. So what I did here is just I aggregated all of the total exports for each economy. So $21,962 million represents the total exports of United States in the telecommunication sector. For India, that's $6,407 million total exports for the telecommunication sector. This is what the data looks like when you put it into a network chart. The circles represents the economies, and the lines represents the trade relationship between one economy into the other. So, for example, this line represents the trade between India and United States. The total exports is $630 million. You'll notice that some connections are heavy or are thick, while some connections have thin lines, and that's because the value of the trade relationship is smaller for those with thin lines compared to those with thick lines. Let's get another example for the ones with smaller trade relationship with India. Norway. So Norway exports to India only $7 million, and India exports to Norway $28 million. Another information you'll see here is that the circles are differently sized. So some are large circles while others are small circles. Let's look at an example of a large circle. So United States. So the circle here represents the amount of total exports. So that's coming from the other data set that I told you earlier. Total exports by United States is $30 million compared to, say, export of India, which is $6.4 million. Let's get a really small one. Vietnam. So Vietnam is only $253 million. So the way that the sizes are scaled, I made it so that those that are small, even though they're small, can still be seen. That's why the sizes are not that different. So it's really up to you on how you want to present your information. Now, another information here is the color. You'll notice that all of the exports that are coming from India are colored red. So these lines are all exports by India. And then the lines that are exported by the other country are either blue or yellow. Now the differentiation is based on the amount of the export. I colored as yellow exports that contributed to the top 10% of the total exports for India. And you'll notice that those economies with the heavy lines, Thailand, United States, Netherlands, Singapore, they are the top economies that are trading with India, while the others are not contributing a lot to India. So you can say that these are the economies that are important for the telecommunication sector with India. Let's go through some concepts that we've learned earlier. First one is the positioning. So in this network chart, by design, India sits at the center of the network chart. We've talked about the circles or the economies. So in network concept, we call them the nodes. And we've talked about two characteristics of the nodes, the color and the size. So in our network, we represented the size based on their total exports and the color based on the economies that are on the value of their trade with India. So the top economies are in gold, all the other economies are in blue, and India is colored red. Another concept that we learned are the connections between one economy into the other, and we call those the edges. Similar with the nodes, the edges also have characteristics such as the weight, which is represented by the width of the connection, and the color, which copies the color of the economy where the trade came from. Now let's try to come up with measures to describe our network. The first one, network size. This is the easiest one, and it's only the number of nodes or the number of economies in our network. So for our network, we selected all economies that are trading with India without filtering. So we got 63 economies. Next is density, or the proportion of the number of connections over the total possible connections. So you just count all of the connections you have on the network. So that's 62 economies connected to India times 2, because that's going in and out of India. So that's your numerator. And then our denominator is just the total possible connections if all nodes or all economies are connected. So we can get that by multiplying the total number of nodes times the total number of nodes minus 1. The density of our network is 3.17%. Lastly, components is just the number of subgroups in your network where all nodes are connected to each other. So these are what you call a subnetwork that are distinct with each other or not connected with each other. In our network chart, all of the nodes are connected with each other, so there's only one component. Next is, let's try to describe some statistics that describe the node positions. Statistics that describe the node position, we call it centrality measures. And a sample of centrality measures are weighted in degree and weighted out degree. The first one, in degree, just gives us an idea of the total flows to the economy versus the total network flows. So if you look at one economy, this gives you the total proportion of the imports of that economy to the total imports of your network. Of course, we expect India to be the highest since we selected all trade flows that are going in and out of India. The next top economies are United Kingdom and United States. So this means that these are the economies that are importing high values of telecommunications to India. The ones that are importing low are Croatia, Latvia, and Kazakhstan. The opposite of import, export. So that would be the total flows from the economy versus the total network flows. And again, we expect India to be the top. The other top economies are rest of the world and United States. The bottom ones are Cambodia, Fiji, Bhutan. What's interesting here is that United States is both part of the top and part of the top for both in degree and out degree. So it means it is a high importer and exporter of trade with India. So United States is kind of a very important economy for India in the telecommunication sector. United Kingdom is only on the imports, so it's importing a lot to India, but it's not a high exporter to India. Okay, so we're now gonna move on to our second case study, and we're gonna try to produce a more complex network graph than the first one. For our second case study, I chose still the telecommunications sector, but this time I'm not focusing on India, but on the top economies or the top exporters and importers within the telecommunication sector. We're still going to use the same data source, the exports, the composition. 2020, we're still selecting telecommunications in the same columns, but this time, for the economies, we're only selecting those that contribute to the 90% of total world exports. The reason why we're filtering is because if we're selecting all exports, we're going to be selecting 3,906 edges or relationships between the economies, and that will clutter our network chart. So what I did was to only select the relevant ones, or those that are contributing to the total 90% of the world exports for the telecommunication sector. When I did the filter, I was able to select 57 nodes or 57 economies out of 63, but reduced the number of connections to 490, or 30% of the total, 13% of the total trade relationships. And this is a really good reduction while maintaining most information on your data. Before we show you the network chart, I'm gonna first discuss with you two additional centrality measures. First one is out degree and the second one is in degree. Now this is quite similar with the earlier measure, except that these measures are not weighted by the value of the connection. So to compute the out degree, we just need to count the number of nodes connected from an economy to the total number of nodes. So that an economy that is trading a lot or connected to a lot of economies will have high degree measure. The second one, in degree, is just the number of nodes connected to an economy. The same interpretation, economies with high connection or high in degrees means they are importing to a lot of other economies. Out degree in trade network terms is simply just the percentage of exports, and then in degree is the percentage of imports by count of nodes. This is what the data looks like using network chart. The nodes are still the same. The sizes are based on the total exports of that economy. So large circles represent high exports, and then the edges are also the same. So they represent the export from one economy to the other. So this is the export of India to Nepal, around $124 million. Now the difference here is that the color now represents the out degree centrality. And we learned from earlier that this degree centrality represents the percentage of connections of that economy. So those that are lightly colored or close to yellow are nodes that are highly connected to all other economies, such as the rest of the world, United States, United Kingdom. So you would say that these are the top economies or the central economies. Those in the middle are the ones that are colored yellow-green or green. We have here India. So it means that these economies are still well connected to all other economies, but not as much as those that are colored yellow. Now what I find interesting here is that There are economies where the total exports does not seem to be proportionate to the number of economies that they are connected to. What I mean by here is that United States, since this is a big economy, you expect it also to be connected to a lot of all other economies. Cambodia here is a small economy in terms of exports, and it's only connected to one other economy, which is the rest of the world economy. But interestingly, China, which has a low total exports of $942 million, India is even higher. Luxembourg is higher at $3,000 million, but the degree centrality is higher for China compared to, say, Luxembourg. China is at 0.18, while Luxembourg is 0.14. Let's see another one. You have here Thailand. Thailand's degree centrality is only 0.02, while in China is 0.18. Even though the total exports of Thailand is higher at $3,000 million compared to China at $942 million. What this means is that China, even though the total exports is smaller, it's exporting to a lot of all other economies compared to Thailand, where the exports are concentrated to rest of the world and the Philippines. So just a few economies. Let's review the concepts and analysis we've learned earlier. So again, in generating the chart, we use the same node size, edge color, and edge weight definition, but the node color is now based on the out degree centrality measure, where the lighter the color, the higher the centrality is. We also provided an example, United States, which has a really high total exports and also high degree centrality measure, which means that it is quite important to the whole network community. We also looked at India, which has a smaller total exports in compared to United States, but still the degree centrality measure is quite important at 0.57. So it means that it is also well connected to all the other economies within your network. And finally, we also look at an interesting case, which is China, which has a small amount of exports, but the connectivity is higher than those economies with a little bit higher total exports than China. And that's because China, even though the exports are small, are still connecting to a few more economies. We compared it to Thailand, where the total export is a little bit higher than China, but the out degree centrality is a lot smaller than China, because Thailand's exports is concentrated to just a few economies. And then lastly, I tried to see how the network chart evolved over time, and I used the density measure as a measure of the evolution of the network chart. So remember that the density measure measures the total connections of your network versus the total possible connections. So a higher density means that your economies are more connected to each other. So there they are trading with they are trading with a lot of other economies compared to say a lower density value. And we see here that in 2017, 2007, 2008, we have high density values similar to what we have in 2019. So you'll notice that the chart, even though the edges or the weights of the trade is smaller in 2007 and 2019, the connectivity is somewhat the same, meaning the trade is distributed across multiple economies. In comparison to say looking at 2016 only, where the amount of trade is somewhat comparable with 2019, but the number of connections is a lot lower than in 2007 and 2019. So this means that the trades were made by a fewer number of economies compared to these years. So other than the measures that we've learned today, there are also other that you can research on, and they are also quite interesting. One one is betweenness. So this is a centrality measure where the value is based on the path, and betweenness kind of give us an idea of bridge nodes or nodes that connect one subnetwork into the other. Eigenvalue is also another centrality measure that gives us an idea of nodes that are well connected to other nodes that are also highly connected. I've talked about subnetworks, and in order to identify them, you need to have you need to apply community detection algorithms. There are multiple community detection algorithms. I wasn't able to list it down here. And then lastly, on visualization, what I have shown you is a sample visualization using gravity-based models, but there are a lot of different ways in order to show your network, such as basing the layout on a spring layout. So it's kind of a Fibonacci sequence of spiral. And then another one is a circular layout where your nodes are lined up in a circle. Another one is basing your positions on the map. So your economy is based on their positions on the world map. And that ends my presentation. I hope that you learned a lot from this session, and it's enough to inspire you to create network charts for whatever use case you think might be appropriate for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that session on network analysis. Um, if we can open the so I think a couple of questions have already been answered. Um, if anybody has any further questions, then they can also mention the same. Okay, in case of no further questions, I have a few. The network analysis is also found in the MRIoT web page in ADB.
I don't think sample network charts were published, but there are network charts available in publications of the GBC publication per country.
Okay, so if somebody wanted to do this network analysis by themselves, like how would they proceed with it?
Oh, okay. The first thing that I did was first to research on potential applications in order for me to see where if it can be applied to that particular use case. And then I tried to understand the concepts, which is what we did throughout the session here. Understand what it means to do network analysis. So we need to understand nodes, edges, positioning, centrality measures, community detection, and so on. And then there is a little bit technicality since you have to know how to code. It will be very difficult to do this in Excel. So for programming, I use Python, but if you are used to doing R, it can also be done in R. I also did the visualizations using Python, but there are other softwares that doesn't need coding, such as Gephi. So Gephi is a free software. It's just a point and click, so you can just drag and drop your data set, and it will produce the chart for you. But there is a learning curve as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Any further questions from the audience? I think people are still trying to absorb your
Right.
presentation. I think it
It's
was,
very different from the earlier
yeah,
topics, you know.
yeah, it was. Just another question. You on one of the charts, I think China's share was quite small, which was
Yes.
surprising. United States was a bright yellow light. UK was also a bright yellow light. India was relatively larger than China. Is it because you selected only telecommunications, or is it because of the definitions that you used,
Okay.
or the data that you used that led to a smaller share of China? Because they are the largest exporting economy in the world right now. So
Yes, yes. The first reason is that I only selected the telecommunication sector.
yeah.
And then the top economies in there are UK, US, and India in top four.
To the best of my knowledge, I think India imports more telecommunication. There is a question in the chat now, if you can have a look at it.
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any studies now that were specific to the Indian economy.
If I may just add to your response to that particular question, China may export a lot in any given industry. I'm not specifically referring to the telecommunication, but could very well be applicable to telecommunication. Its domestic value addition could be smaller, right? So in gross terms, of course, it could be huge, but in specific industries, its domestic value addition could be smaller, and in fact, India's domestic value addition could be higher. So that might be one of the reasons. That might be the principal reason that the way that the chart is depicted.
I mean,
Oh,
yeah, I think this is the first time I'm getting introduced to the MRIoT database of ADB. And I think especially yesterday's session, and more importantly today's session, where you use the different indicators for value addition and non-value addition trade. I think that shows up, gives a lot of insights on, I mean, even just simple tabulation of charts, figures, and tables it's giving, I mean, assuming what you said about China is right, then um, I mean, it just changes the way India, and suppose India wants to expand its exports of telecommunications. It just changes the way India can look at its trade policy, like, or industrial policy. Like, instead of looking at China, it can maybe look at the US or UK or even Thailand for that matter. Because although total Chinese exports may be higher, if the domestic value addition is less, then maybe India's exports may be lesser than China's. But if the value addition is more, that means there's more investment happening domestically. If there's more investment happening domestically, that means even in a capital intensive industry like telecommunications, jobs are being generated. So even though the total exports may be less, higher domestic value addition would, I think, in some way also mean that India's supply chain is more resilient, and there is more domestic production happening. So the per dollar, the domestic production per dollar is higher. Like, I mean, this is just a simple reading based on your statement and what I looked at the graphics that were showed. So I think this is just my thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, just to supplement what you said, what we are trying to measure is how much at the end of the day a country is actually benefiting from trade, right? Which means how much income is generated for the country, and which is almost equal to the domestic value added, which is almost equal to the GDP, right? And the classic example would be Philippines. At one point in time, its total trade was huge, huge volumes of imports of electronics and electronic parts, and equally huge volumes of exports. However, very little, relatively speaking, there's a very little income addition to the economy, because all that was happening is like very basic activity related to polishing, cleaning, simple assembly, and so on. Right? So even though the trade itself is huge in terms of volume as well as in total value, because it's gross. Net addition to income was very, very small. Right. However, if you look at the BPO sector of the Philippines, its net addition to the economy is huge, simply because of the local value addition. Right? So that's why the newer thinking in terms of trade policy should be taking the value added trade uh, more in the policy framework.
Great, thank you. I think a lot of research can be done based on the MRIoT database, and since it's time series, you can evaluate the same sector over time. I think the continuous one starts from 2011, if I'm not wrong. So from 2011 to 20, like you can even take snapshots 11, maybe 15, 20. So there's a lot of interesting things. There's a comment from Miss Isha Chawla on can a user-friendly code for applications be expected from ADB? So it's a request from her end.
Joseph?
Okay, so if I may add, there are a couple of things, right? One is um, the subject matter itself is highly specialized and requires a lot of background knowledge in trade, international trade, and specifically supply chain analysis, right? So one cannot wish away that background knowledge. All right, it is meant. This type of analysis is meant for the de facto actual practitioner of international trade with the substantial knowledge in the subject matter. Now, that's sort of just a background to this. Specifically in terms of applying the models and automated version of the models, and specific coding that can be customized. What we have done, just so that we build the base properly, we have taken the long route, in the sense that we have painstakingly operationalized all the models there is. And then, of course, there are more and more models coming up with researchers delving into the subject matter. So we have taken all the necessary care and invested all the necessary resources in developing these models. However, we realize the importance of a more user-friendly, or more sort of some kind of a user interface, development of a user interface that can help easier implementation or application of these models. So that's in the plans but not yet in the works, right? Maybe sometimes in the near future we'll be able to get to it. However, our team is always there to help anyone to use the model for their specialized work in this area.
Great, great, thank you. I just have a small request. Now, a lot of ground has been covered, including the different databases that exist. It's a request from my end, and I will share this with the participants. If if we request, if ADB can send an email, so like with the main MRIoT link and the different links within MROT where they can go to access the different databases, including the one that was used for GVC and the definition. So I think then instead of just going to the database and searching for themselves, they'll have all the links with them. And I think this can be a good starting ground for them. And as I had mentioned previously, I think yesterday and the day before, the participants I had circulated the list of the email IDs. So they and I think ADB is open to answering queries on this, and I think they also would like the MRIT databases to be used widely. So I think sharing this would also help in generating more queries. So this is just a suggestion from my end, and I hope ADB can accept it.
So we are working on it, and as we are sort of in a continuous development mode, even the MRIoT website and the specific links and various databases, they are all evolving, right? And we are hoping that things would solidify as we move forward sooner than later. However, we'll take upon your suggestion, and we'll start compiling that list in a more user-friendly form so that any interested user can start with it and then, of course, approach us for help anytime.
Great, great. Thank you very much. Today has also been a very interesting session. And if there are no further queries or questions from anybody, then I think we can call it a day for today. And we will start again tomorrow, 2:30 p.m. Indian time. We are reaching the end of it, so think of it as a build-up and the social accounting matrix as the end of the entire story, starting from the Leontief matrix. So tomorrow we'll have an introduction to the social accounting matrix, followed by a summary of the entire workshop. So I look forward to welcoming all of you for tomorrow. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you again, ADB, for giving your time and for sharing these excellent presentations. Thank you very much. Thank you.